Yeah, good. Good evening. Hello. I know people are still coming in. Please still make your way to your seat and grab your stuff. I'm not trying to rush you, but want to get things started because important things are about to happen. Welcome. My name is Shelley Woodruff. I am one of the pastors here at First Baptist Decatur, and until about 3 minutes ago, I was making pinwheels on the front lawn with a whole bunch of kids at the farmer's market, and now I get to be in this space with all of you, getting to be a part of the conversation that's about to happen. What a gift. What an evening that we've already had and we're getting ready for. So on behalf of the church community, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for making time in your evening to be part of this conversation and this dialogue, to be willing and open, to be challenged and to learn something new and to walk away from this evening just a little bit changed. It's a gift to be able to be a part of that and help facilitate that here on our campus. Important things you need to know. We have restrooms that are in this room, men's on this side, women's on that side. If you don't want to come up to the front where everyone can see you, there are also restrooms in the hallways out that way. So we hope that you feel welcome, and we look forward to the evening together. I'm going to introduce my colleague that's a privilege to work on staff with, Pastor David, who's going to introduce the important people behind me.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, all of you, for being here. And we are so privileged to be a part of this. This is really the second part of a three-part evening that we have, or three-part series that we have this week that is dealing with racial justice and learning about each other and being challenged on very, very important issues. So I want to thank our guest tonight for what they're going to be sharing with us and what John has already shared with us in the power of his words in More Than I Imagined. So I'll say more about that in just a moment and introduce also Nibs. But first, let me just share a brief introduction on John's book. If you've not purchased it already, it is available in the back. But it is a story of John's pilgrimage. It's a story about loneliness and anger, a story about racism and resilience, a story about West Baltimore, Aunt Fanny and foster homes, a traveling hero father, a mysteriously absent mother, Mr. Bill and I Surrender All, a beige Bible on a living room table, a mythological Theseus and the string out of the labyrinth with his brother Patrick, a library card, Aunt Sylvie, spiritual tools and radical integration, emerging wisdom, broadened perspective, a mother found, an aunt discovered, contact theory lived out, cards and letters finally read, grace, hope, self-discovery, family, and love. I encourage you to discover these as you read through John, this amazing book about your beautiful life. Thank you for sharing with us, and thank you for being here tonight. Also, Nibs Stroupe is famous and infamous in the Decatur and Oakhurst area and the Atlanta area. Nibs, it's great to have you back. We got to work together BC before COVID in this space where Nibs was here introducing and interviewing another important author. And so it's great to have you back, Nibs. 34 years, Nibs was the pastor of Oakhurst Presbyterian Church, co-pastoring with his wife, Caroline, who is here with us tonight. You probably were co-pastor with him for longer than you had intended, maybe, but did both of you amazing, it was a paycheck, yeah. But did amazing work in this area on racial reconciliation very early, and also healthcare, radical healthcare, radical integration, and cutting edge radical love. So thank you both for being here. Nibs, thank you for your help tonight. Welcome all of you. Thank you for sharing this space with us. We like to say in our sanctuary and in this space, this too is a sanctuary, which means, of course, sacred space. It also means safe space, And we hope tonight we feel together that it is indeed brave space that we share together. Welcome, glad you're here.
Thank you, David, and thank you, John, for a great book. If you haven't gotten this book, please do so. It is a powerful book. As Caroline, my co-pastor and spouse, said, it's a real page turner, so it is. So please get to it. We're going to talk a little bit among ourselves for a while, and then we'll open it up for questions that you might have. We want to emphasize questions and not so much sermons or comments. If you've got genuine questions, please do that. There'll be plenty generated out of this and even out of what Pastor David said. But I first met John through his writings at the AJC. He was a reporter there, and he did great work, and I often read his articles. And I think it was 1995 or 96, he came to Oakhurst Presbyterian to cover us and to write on the church, and gave us a great spread and a great article, and we struck up. Of course, I was recruiting him as a member, so I went to visit with him, and he recounts that first visit in the book, which I give thanks for. He became a member there and an elder there, and we give thanks for his ministry. And I'm grateful that he asked me to have this conversation with him. So thank you, John. So I'm going to jump right in, and we'll get going. And I want to start with what motivated you to write this book? I know that you covered the Freddie Gray killing in Baltimore. Had you been thinking about the book before then, and that kind of pushed you over? Or what was the germination of this book?
Okay. Before I answer, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight.
Amen.
Thank you, Nibs. And this is a work night, so I really appreciate it, everyone coming out. I see a lot of old friends, and so thank you so much. What motivated the germ of the book started, the germ of the idea began when I was assigned to cover a race riot, uprising, rebellion in my neighborhood in Baltimore. In 2015, Freddie Gray, a young black man, died in police custody. So I was assigned to go cover that event. And that had significance for me because that's the neighborhood I grew up in. There's a famous picture of Gray being handcuffed by police officers, being led away. I know exactly where that spot is. I used to go there on summer nights to hang out with a buddy of mine. And my neighborhood is also known not just for that terrible racial upheaval, but also for this HBO series called The Wire. Mm. And so when anyone ever thinks about West Baltimore, where I grew up, they think about violence, racism. And so when I went there and I saw my neighborhood going up in flames, you know, the place where I went to school, there were National Guardsmen, I was struck by how what I saw in my neighborhood contrasted with my private life. My neighborhood was coming apart because of racism, but the white and black members of my family were coming together despite racism. And I was like wondering what happened in my family that's not happening in places like Baltimore all over the country. So that was the beginning of the idea, and I started to interview people in my family. My editor, Jan Winburn, gave me some great advice. She said, just because they're family members, you have to interview them. So I treated my father and people in my family like sources. I just called them, and I had these long conversations, and I taped them. And my father grew pretty annoyed with all my questions. And I remember telling him, I said, Dad, I'm thinking about writing a book. And he said, what are you going to write about? I said, I want to write about some of the racial issues I had growing up in this neighborhood in Baltimore that was all black, and nobody liked white people. And he said, but you didn't have any racial issues. So he was really clueless about what I was going through and my brother was going through. So that was the beginning of the idea.
Okay, all right. Well, I want you to talk a little bit about your childhood in West Baltimore. At least from my white male reading eyes, it sounded like a Charles Dickens novel. Your mother was absent, your dad was gone to the Merchant Marine a lot working, and you were in and out several foster homes, you and Pat. So tell us a little bit about your childhood. And I think the white view is that, oh, this is a ghetto, it's terrible, it's awful. And I had some of that reaction, but there's also what you were kind of hinting at. There was a deeper, more powerful life in there, too.
Yeah, my childhood was really shaped by a mystery. And that mystery was when I grew up, I didn't know who my mother was. I had no recollection of her. There was no picture of her in the house. No one talked about her. No one told me why she disappeared and where she went. So as I said in the book, I felt like I came into the world with half of my identity amputated. And the only thing I knew about this white side of my family was this. They told me, your mother's name is Shirley, she's white, and her family hates black people. So that's all I knew. So I'm growing up here, and you mentioned Charles Dickens. I didn't think of it like that at the time, but you're a kid, that's all you know. And there were very tough times looking at my brother Patrick. We spent most of our times in foster homes. And because our father was a merchant seaman, so he spent probably about 8 months of the year overseas. And that was very tough. You don't have your mother or your father around. But one of the things I learned through that process is that when you're in situations like that, I don't know how else to say it. I think I'm going to talk a little theological since we're in a church.
All right, okay. All right, let's get to it.
When you're in a situation like that, God will send people to you to help you. And one of the first persons I really remember was a guy named Mr. Bill. He was a guy that lived in a foster home. And I used to go to the kitchen at night and listen to Mr. Bill sing hymns. And he was so kind to me, he was so kind and pat. And that made a difference. Any kind of kindness you can receive as a kid, you latch on to it. Yeah. And I met teachers along the way who really encouraged me. And more than anything, we had an aunt, my mother's younger sister, who watched us over the weekend, and she was like this surrogate mom. And in the book, I describe her as this a lighthouse in a sea of chaos. And I think a lot of us can relate to this, people in our family that believed in us when no one else did. So though there was a tremendous struggle, you know, the foster homes, there was the escalating violence in my neighborhood, and there was all these questions about my mom, we also had a lot of beautiful people that looked out for us.
Well, we know from the title of your book that you had a white mother and you indicated you have a black dad. So can you tell us a little bit about how they met? And it was in the early 60s, so
Correct.
It was not only frowned upon to have interracial relationships, it was illegal. So at least from the law point of view, it was 67 when Loving versus Virginia okayed interracial marriage. Can you talk a little bit about how they met and why you think they were able to cross those racial barriers in their relationship?
Yes, my father met my mom in 1963, and when he wasn't working as a merchant seaman, he would take odd jobs at home, and he took an odd job in the hospital. He worked in a morgue, and he saw my mom, and she was a nurse's assistant, and he just asked her out for a date, and she said yes. Now, that sounds simple, but in 1963, a black man was taking his life in his hand, and my mom was defying her family and her entire world. And so they began to go out, and they immediately experienced a lot of tremendous persecution. When they would walk on the street, you know, police officers would stop them, harass my father. People would stare and glare at them. I do remember my father telling me that they went into a bar one night, and when they sat at the bar, they would order a drink, and after they would finish drinking it, the bartender would take the glass and he would shatter them in front of them like they had contaminated it. So to try to answer, get to your question, one of the mysteries I wanted to try to address in the book is, why would my parents take such a chance during those days? Why would my father do that? For my father, I think he did that in part because I think part of it was because of two things in his life. He told me that he was raised by a father who was a drunk, who he didn't respect. And he told me that when he was a young man, he was about 12, a white man slapped him in front of his father, and his father did nothing. And so he told me, and I don't know if I can use mild profanity. I don't know. I'll just use very mild profanity. He said, he told me, he said, my father was a scared-ass Nigger. So I think when my father saw that, he says, I'm not going to live that way. So I think that was part of it. Okay. But the second part is that my father was a merchant seaman, and that was key. So he was a man who spent most of his time overseas. And so he didn't move in this segregated world as much. So when he went overseas, he was treated more as a man. And when he was on those ships with other white sailors, they treated him more like a man, because on the ship, the only thing that mattered was, can you trust this man with your life? So he was accustomed to living a certain way. So for him to ask out my mom, for a date, he's like, I'm not going to be like my father, and this is the way I'm accustomed to being treated. So it was more natural for him. Now, why would my mother do that? To be honest, it's still a mystery. And I've actually written about this. I see my editor, Brandon Griggs, out there. I remember writing the story for CNN probably about a year ago, and what I said is that there are a lot of white people that are born in this country who never buy into racism. I mean, we're all human, we all have biases, but it's like a mystery. They grow up in these worlds where they're surrounded by racism, their families are racist, but they just don't absorb it. They instinctively, say no to it. And my mom was that type of person. And I remember my family saying that when she would come around to visit my father, here's this young 20-year-old white woman walking through an all-black neighborhood in 1963, people staring at her. They said she didn't seem to notice. And they said that when she was around black people, she demonstrated such ease. My older half-brother told me, says, if you would have told her she was white, she would have been surprised. I mean, that's how comfortable she was. Okay. So ultimately, I think it's a mystery. I talked to her relatives, and they said she was like that as a little girl. She just accepted people.
Yeah, that's unusual in American culture, so I give thanks for her. Well, your dad had a difficult encounter with your mom's dad.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of that dynamic?
So every kid has like a boogeyman, boogeyman you grow up with. Like the boogeyman is under the bed or the boogeyman's in the closet. My boogeyman was my mother's father, because I just heard these awful stories about what a stone cold racist he was. So when my father went to visit my mom and have a date, instead of my mother answering the door, he answered the door, and he physically assaulted my father, called him the N-word, and then had him arrested. And I remember talking to my editor when I was writing the book, and I was trying to explain to her that what it meant for a black man to be arrested for seeing a white woman those days. I said, he could have not gotten out of jail alive. Right. So that's what happened to him. And one of the most difficult parts of the book is I had to learn how to come to terms with my maternal grandfather, to see him beyond his racism, and to see him as a person and to reconcile with him. And the way that reconciliation took place is a very odd way, very unusual way, but I had to see him as a human, just like some of the other members of my family.
Yeah. That must have been really tough.
Yeah, but I don't know how many people read this article I wrote Sunday for CNN, so a couple of hands. One of the things I try to show in the book is that one of the odd things about meeting the white relatives in my family is that when I first met them, I was very self-righteous. I was like, you've done me wrong. I have nothing to learn from you. All you can do is apologize to me. And the way I saw racism was very different. I saw racism as this: you're either a racist or you're not. There's no in between. But as I got to learn more about my mother, to meet her sister, to meet other members of my family, I began to see you can't define people by their worst act, that people are complex, that these same people in my family that hurt me also taught me about forgiveness and empathy. And that surprised me. I learned from them, and I didn't expect that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about one of those.
Okay.
I guess one of the most interesting characters in the book is your mother's sister, Aunt Mary. So she was the one where you felt like the most distant in terms of race, and yet she became a key to your discovering your family. So can you talk about that kind of journey and that process?
Yeah, this is my other villain during my childhood. Aunt Mary is someone I heard plenty of stories growing up about. She was my mother's sister, and she wanted nothing to do with black people. There was no contact from her. We knew nothing about her. And even as I got to know, later on began to know my mom, she had nothing to do with me. I didn't hear from her. So one day out of the blue, I get she contacts us and says she wants to meet me, and she wants to meet my brother Patrick. And I didn't want to meet her. I'm in my mid-20s, and I'm going on with my life, and I'm like, what is the use? You're going to try to get me to relieve you of your guilt? I'm not going to perform that role. So I met her, and it was very polite conversation. And I thought she wanted to apologize for being absent from my life. I'm sorry I've been racist to you. I'm sorry. It was none of that. We just met, and we talked. And I didn't get any apology. So finally one day I asked her, I said, why didn't you contact us when we were growing up? Was it because we were black? And she became very quiet, and she said, no, it wasn't because you were black. It was because you weren't Catholic. So,
That's a new one. I haven't heard that
yeah,
one
so I
before.
guess religious prejudice is preferable to racial prejudice. But when I heard that, and I don't know if you remember Pat, I'm talking to my brother, I was furious. I called Pat. I'm like, come on. You know, and I wanted nothing to do with her. But then the story progresses. I kept Aunt Mary at a distance. She wrote all these letters to me over the years, like birthday letters and things like that. And I didn't want anything to do with her. And then I tell people, for people who read the article, CNN, I had a racial awakening. And I had it in all places, a Lowe's home improvement store in Midtown. So bear with me, people who've heard this story. I mean, Brandon, you've heard the story. I've told it, but it's just crucial.
It's powerful.
Yeah. So I go to Lowe's one Saturday morning to get paint for my backyard deck. And I go to one in Midtown, and I go there, and there's a black man and a white man behind the counter. And the black man is not doing anything. He's not seeing a customer. But the white man is on the phone. So I wait for about 5 minutes until he's off the phone. And then I go up to him, I ask him, like, what's the right paint for my deck? And he tells me, and he gives me the paint. And I take it home, and I start to paint my deck, and I open it up, the paint can is the wrong color. And then it hit me. I was like, I didn't get the right color because I couldn't see past color. I racially profiled a black man. Now, if you went in my house, you would see all these books by Robert DiAngelo, Ibram Kendi. I knew all about racial bias, but in that millisecond, I profiled a black man. I said, man, racism is powerful. That made me think about Aunt Mary in a new way. So what I did is, after that, I kept all these letters from my aunt in a box under my desk. I never opened them. Most of them were not opened, and because I didn't want to hear from her. And I said, let me look at these letters again. And I began to tear them open, and I began to read them. And it hit me. Everything I wanted from her was in those letters. She apologized for not reaching out to me when I was younger, my brother. She said it was because of race. She said I was ashamed to have 2 black nephews. She said, I hope you can forgive me. And she told me, if you don't want to talk to me, I understand that. But she did more. She wanted to know more about me. She said that I grew up in this all-white world. When I went to school, they didn't even talk about slavery or the civil rights movement. That's all I knew. And so she just reached out to me. She was apologetic, and I didn't see it because I was so angry. And after that, our relationship changed. And it got to the point where I remember one day we were talking, and she just said, don't worry about that, John. We're family. And I'm like, wow, we're family. I even heard from her today. Give you an example. So I don't know if everybody can relate to this. You grow up with a mom or maternal figure. If anything bad happens in the city, they call you because they think you're. So when I was growing up, my surrogate aunt, I went to school in D.C., if something remotely bad happened in D.C., she would call me and say, are you all right? I'm like, Aunt Sylvia, that happened, I'm all right. The Russians didn't get me, whatever. Today, we know there was, unfortunately, another mass shooting. Who did I get a text from? Aunt Mary, wanting to know, am I all right? How did this woman go from that to this? And this is part of the story I tell, and I think it's so important to tell those type of stories right now.
Well, let's talk about race a little bit, since it's part of your book. As you discovered, and we all know, it's pretty complex. So what would you want to tell folk about did you learn about race as you wrote? And then what would you want to tell people that are classified as white and people that are classified as black or other categories that the system of race has about internalizing and finding ways out of that?
Well, I think the message, I'm very reluctant about messages I can share because I don't consider myself like a brilliant scholar like a lot of people write about race. That's not my forte, but I have experience in it from different angles.
Well, you write well about race.
Well, thank you. But what I have learned is this. When I became a journalist, and I'm looking at a lot of journalists in here, I wanted to come become a journalist to change people, to make things better. And as I began to write about race a lot, I began to think, how do we change racial attitudes? How do things get better? And I think many people thought that something would change when Obama was elected. You know, we felt there was going to be some kind of turning of the corner. And then with the rise of social media and all these videos, I thought, golly, surely when white Americans see these videos of unarmed black people being murdered and brutalized, that would change. No. And I just looked back at my career, and I was like, wow, I've been writing about race a long time. I covered the Rodney King riots or rebellion, and I remember people talking about racial reckonings and all that. And I'm like, what are we missing? What are we not doing? And the thing that I would say that I have learned by looking at my family life and looking at the experiences I had going to your church, the church you pastored and you led with Inez and all, is something I repeat all the time, and that is facts don't change people, relationships do. And I have learned that through experience. I used to think if you gave people the right information, you gave them brilliant books, that will change people, but that's not enough. People have to be in relationships, in communities of people that are different. That's the thing that really changes people. And I think, for me, we've forgotten that in the past couple of years. Because we've had these dramatic protests, and we think that's enough. But a lot of white Americans, when they came out to those protests, guess what they did? They went back to their all-white neighborhoods, and they sent their children to their all-white schools. And you can't have change unless you also create these conditions for those kind of relationships. That's the thing that has stood out to me.
Well, the church has been important in your life, and you just talked about it some. So, as you said, Aunt Sylvia, as I remember you describing so well of her encouraging you strongly to go to church, you and Pat. So, I guess, talk a little bit about the church's importance in your life growing up in the black community, but also how you see the church in today's world, and how, if there's anything the church can do with these kind of issues of race, as you indicated.
Yeah, so I was raised up with, with a dual identity, and it wasn't just black and white, but it was also, I was raised in a black church, but in a white evangelical church. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in a black church, and I saw the power of the black church, the music, the emphasis on the emotional release. I saw people who just had tremendous depth and spirituality. They might not have had a lot of intellect, as far as book learning, but their faith. So I grew up with that tradition. But when I became a Christian in college, I joined the white evangelical church. So I saw that experience. And those experiences really shaped me. And they were key to me reconciling with my white family members, because one of the things I had to learn is, how do you forgive? How do you accept people who didn't accept you? And church gave me that model, that language for forgiveness and for grace. I had already gone through that, going to these churches, and for the first time, church was the first time that I became vulnerable with white people. I remember when I was in Chicago one summer, and I had to go to a Bible study, and it was in a neighborhood. I'd never gone there before, and I remember walking up the steps, and I looked in the window before I rang the doorbell, and I saw nothing but white people, and I hesitated. And I remember what I thought. I said, dang, nothing but white people. I didn't want to be the only black man in the room. But I went into that door, and these people that I thought I had nothing in common with, two of those people became some of my best friends. That was very key for me.
All right. So what do you think, what would you say to the church in the United States today about dealing with race because we have the opportunity in church and religious places to form those relationships, but we're still very segregated. So
we are, and you can speak to this because you, Caroline, Inez, about this. But what I would say is this: we see now with the rise of Christian nationalism how racism has taken over a lot of white churches. And there are churches, white churches, that are trying to do something about it. But I would say this: I have found that there's a huge difference between a racially mixed church and an integrated church. In a racially mixed church, black and brown people are in the pews. In a racially integrated church, black and brown people not only in the pews, but they share power. Yeah. And that's a huge difference. Yeah. I'll give you an example. My brother's sitting there. he went to a church in Charlotte, mega church. They loved bragging about how, racially mixed they were. They loved it. They would advertise it. And they had a black member who used to sit on the front row of the church. He was a very large, dark black man. And so when the preacher would preach, he would get up, shout hallelujah, and do all that. That's black church stuff. That's call and response. That's normal. That freaked out the people in the church, so much so that they asked him to leave.
Oh, wow.
So it was mixed.
Yeah.
But he was only welcome if he acted more like white people.
Yeah.
He couldn't bring himself and his culture into it. That's the difference. When I went to Oakhurst, the church you pastored, Caroline, I went in there, I saw all these elements of worship that spoke to me. You had testimony time, you had the brown Jesus up there, you had Jesus with women as disciples. There were arguments over power, and that's another thing. People think that you have these racially mixed church, that if you don't have conflict, that means things are working. Sometimes that means things ain't working.
Yeah,
You got to talk about stuff. You got to bring it out in open. We
Right.
had a lot of arguments and debates at Oakhurst. That was healthy. So that's what I would say. And I would finally say this. For white churches to survive in this country, they have to deal with their racism. And it's not just a spiritual question, it's an existential question. Because white churches ain't growing. White birth rate is falling. And all these new immigrants that are coming to America who are Christians come from the global south. They come from places like South America and Africa. If these white churches don't find a way to incorporate them, they won't survive.
All right. When Catherine Meeks and I wrote the book on Ida Wells, we would often get a question about what enabled Ida Wells to do it. So she wasn't there, we were conjecturing, but you're here. So what enabled you to get out of this kind of crushing situation? I know you had Aunt Sylvia and you had your dad every now and then, but what do you think the things were that got you out of the sense that you weren't anything and that you were something, you were somebody?
Just beautiful people that stepped into my life. Aunt Sylvia, I think we all can relate to, somebody who believes in you when no one else believes in you. When you're a kid like that, any little shred of hope you hold on to. And I think that was a big thing. I think reading helped me a lot.
Yeah.
So I grew up in a pre-internet era. There were no video games. We had 3 television stations, and I don't know if you remember when the television would go off at 1 o'clock in the morning, and the flag would come up. So I had a lot of time on my hand. So I would read these stories, and they would help me escape. And that was also very key. Yeah. And finally, I have to say this, a little bit of it was luck. So for example, I wanted to be a journalist. So I grew up in Baltimore. D.C. Was only like 45 minutes away, and when I went to school, I went to Howard University. They just happened to have probably the best journalism program that a HBCU could have, and I just happened to live nearby. So sometimes luck, being in a certain place, was very helpful. But I want to say this too, you asked me that question. Sometimes I read these stories in the media, and they talk about people, like black people who come from my world, and they talk about them like they're extraordinary, and I think they're, in some ways, very dangerous stories.
Right.
I'm not extraordinary.
Yeah.
I'm very normal.
Right.
The people I grew up with, there were so many people that were much smarter, or just as smart as I was, So if you give people the right environment, the right people, the right incentives, what I've been able to do, other people would do from the same environment. I'm not particularly special.
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize you're not exceptional, which is, you are exceptional. But yeah, I think that's a point well taken, that it does take those relationships. We want to open it up for questions, so if you have questions, we're looking for questions, not long sermons. So I guess raise your hand and Pastor David or someone will bring a mic to you, and we'll get some in a minute.
Actually, Nibs, it'll be a little harder than that. If you want to ask a question, you've got to stand up and come out.
Okay, all right. The Right Reverend Mickey Goodson has told us we need how to do it.
Okay.
Okay.
And
so,
we'll help out too.
So just get to a mic, however you get it.
John?
Hey, Wayne.
You know it's me, so I'm going to start with a zinger of a question. I imagine this was a tearful journey for you, and if so, did you ultimately find joy despite the pain of, picking at the scab and finding out what you ultimately discovered?
Well, thank you for that really good question. I was told that when you write a book that you will remember things that you had buried, and I didn't believe that. And but as I started to tell the story, and I began to talk to Patrick and talk to Terry, my wife, about all these things, it was true. There were a lot of things that I had buried, I had forgotten. Like, for example, I didn't know that I ran away from the foster home, so that's how we escaped. When I was about 12, I couldn't deal with it anymore, and I took my brother, who was my younger brother, and I said, we're leaving, and we just left. And I was so afraid when I did that, but I guess I was so afraid that I buried the memory. But yeah, those, to answer your question, those were some, painful memories, but if you read the book, to me, it's so much more about joy and finding a way to transcend that, to get past that. And for me, the overwhelming emotion I experienced reliving this memory, all these memories, it was not one of pain, but it was one of gratitude. That I was so blessed to have these beautiful people around me to help me. And that's what I remember, just more than anything, just gratitude and joy.
Hi.
Hi, Jessica.
So, were there family members who objected to you writing this? And if so, how did you navigate that?
Yeah, my father didn't like this. My father was I think my father looked at me like, are you really my son? I mean, because I was so different. I was introverted and bookish, and he was this merchant seaman who liked to run the streets and do all sorts of things, some illegal, some legal, and all that. But he didn't want me to write that because you have a family member that has a severe mental illness. There was such a stigma. Nobody talked about it. So that was to happen in our family. Not only do we not talk about race, we didn't talk about mental illness. So here I am with all these questions, and so people didn't like it. Some people didn't like it. But I just persisted and I asked the questions. I was really concerned about my mother's sister, my Aunt Mary. How would my white aunt react to me telling the story about her denying her racism? How would she react to me describing how her family, treated me? But she was beautiful with it. She said, it's the truth, So I was reluctant to answer your question, and a lot of people, were very opposed to it. Not a lot, but some. But as I, began to talk to them and get the stories out, they just told the stories, and then they forgot that I was writing a book. So that was really, helpful. They didn't, So that's how that happened. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Jessica stole my question. But I want to ask you, do you ever get fatigue talking about race and racism? Because it exhausts me at this point. But you do such a great job explaining it and talking about it, but do you ever get tired of it?
Yes, thank you. I do. But I just feel like there aren't that many journalists, in the position that I've been in that come from the type of environment that I come from. Not only to come from a place like West Baltimore, where there's a lot of, poverty and violence. And Lisa, you come from Baltimore, so you know what I'm talking about. You're right. So I feel like I have to talk about it because that's part of why I'm there. And I have written stories at CNN that have made people uncomfortable because of the emotion in it. And I'm seeing Anissa, who knows, what that's like because she, she looks over my stories. She does a great job. But I remember I wrote a story about a year and a half ago with the headline, "There's nothing more dangerous in America than an angry white man." And I was talking about how when you grow up as a black man, you hear all these stereotypes about black men being violent. But when you look at all these shootings, when you look at January 6th and you see all those images, who do you see? Angry white men. So I feel like I have to talk about that despite its race because of where I come from. That's part of the debt I owe to people who made it possible for me to work at CNN. And secondly, I feel like I have to talk about it because I feel like we're at this dangerous point in the country where a lot of people believe that racism is a permanent part of being an American. that we can't get past that. And I'm like, no, look at my family. If we can heal, anybody can change. I've seen people change in incredible ways. So I feel like I have to also tell those stories because I think racism really threatens our democracy now.
Good evening, and thank you. I wondered if you're in conversation with other biracial people from other parts of the world. I find myself I'm biracial. I grew up in Africa. My mother's white American. My father was Nigerian. And I came here when I was 16, and after 40 years, I find myself just really getting into it. And I would love to be in conversation with other biracial people in that it's an identity. I didn't know I was black till I came to America. And I was told I was black. And so I wonder if you're in conversation with other multi-ethnic, multiracial people and how that informs your work.
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah, I've been in conversation with biracial people and biracial support groups for a long time. And what I have found is that in the biracial community, there are all sorts of different ways people interpret biracial identity. There are some biracial people to me who, frankly, I think want to distance themselves from their blackness. And I never really like that. I don't gravitate toward that. And, but there are other biracial people that I think they're parents, they want to raise their children and with a healthy sense of identity. And I think it's so much easier now to be biracial. I mean, you have Obama, you have Kamala Harris, you have all these role models. And one of the things I say in the book is that biracial people, that we are like living embodiments of how America can change. In 1963, if you would have told people that interracial marriage would be common, and that if you go outside of this building in downtown Decatur, you would see all these biracial children and couples, nobody would believe it. But all these people like my mother and father, you know, they went out there and made these courageous decisions, and they changed things. And they created this new world. So we shouldn't be so pessimistic in saying, like, well, we can never do anything about gun violence. We can't change this. Like, wow, we are proof that amazing things can happen and people can change things. So yes, I have been in conversation with biracial people and interracial people, and I find it very good. I think it's like I said, we're hopeful symbols of what this country can be.
Hey.
Hi.
Before we created this new world and you had some of these conversations, how did you respond as a child when other kids came up to you and asked you who you were or what you were? Did you ever get questions like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as I say in the book, is I grew up in West Baltimore as what I call a closeted biracial person. I didn't want anybody to know that I had a white mom. And so for black people, most black people are racially mixed, you know, so I don't really stand out. I can blend, you know, you might see me like, well, maybe there's something else, but people didn't necessarily know. But in my neighborhood, my brother can tell you, just having a fair complexion, that marked you. And so people would come up and say things, they would attack us and call us hunky, this and that. We would get into a lot of fights. And one time my brother, he got really assaulted, really badly, because people thought his mother was white. So the way I dealt with it was shame. I was ashamed of my mother. I didn't want anybody to know. And then when I met her, I was ashamed that she had a mental illness, and I wouldn't tell anybody for years. In fact, when I met my wife, she didn't know for years. And we were recording, she didn't really know. I didn't talk about my mom. But only now can I say I am very proud to be the daughter of my mom. She's an incredible, courageous, resilient woman. And so I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Is it Sammy?
Hi.
Hi.
So I read your, thanks. Sorry, I don't want to knock it over. I read your essay on CNN, which sounds weird because I'm 15, but Kati's my mom, so I think it makes a little more sense. But I have a question about contact theory because I've seen it work in some senses. I'm Jewish, and Okay.
An electric personality.
Yeah, very electric. Thanks. I've seen it work in some senses when my classmates are like, is Hanukkah Jewish Christmas? And I'm like, not really. But on a bigger scale, like with things such as the Holocaust, people didn't go up and be like, hey, you Nazi, I'm Jewish and we're not that bad. Do you want to sit down and have a cup of tea? It's like that didn't really happen and it wouldn't have worked. So I'm wondering, like, when is violence, like what's necessary, and when can you like do contact theory, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I want to make sure I understand it. So, I'll tell people what contact theory is because I talk about it. Don't worry. So you're saying how can contact theory works when you have these like large groups that are hostile? Like, for example, Nazis shared physical proximity with Jewish people, but that didn't lead into any more compassion.
Definitely not.
So that's what the point you're raising, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and also
that's an
like
excellent question.
and also like with slavery, like it's
right.
like mass genocides, except that one was a lot longer. So yeah.
Right, that's an excellent question. So for those who don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about contact theory, one of the things I talk about in my book and the article I wrote this Sunday is a theory called contact theory. And it was created by a psychologist named Gordon Allport. He wrote a classic book on race called The Nature of Prejudice. It came out around 1954. And he created this concept that says to people, we think that racial prejudice can't be reduced, but it can. And it's not just something you can't conquer. But it has to, and you can, what he said is you can get different groups together, different races, people of different religions who hostile to one another, and prejudice can reduce. But to answer your question, there has to be certain conditions, he said. And one of those conditions that these people share roughly equal status. With slavery, masters, so-called masters and enslaved people, there's no equal status. You can't have any reconciliation when one group sees another group as subhuman. The same thing is true with Holocaust. They didn't see Jewish people as people. But Allport said if you can create the conditions where there's roughly equal status, that will happen. And one of the examples I give is that in the military, for example, the military is the most integrated institution in this country. Why? When you go into the military, it doesn't matter whether you're black, white, or whatever, it's all about the mission, and you share roughly equal status. In a church, when I went into church, when you go into a church of a mixed setting, your identity is roughly equal. We're all Christians or another community of worship. We're all people in the synagogue. So if you create those conditions that Allport talked about, you can have it. But you're right, you can't have it in other conditions. Does that make sense? Does it?
Yeah, and if it's not those conditions, is it okay for like the U.S. military to go in and kill the Nazis?
Is it okay for the U.S. military to kill Nazis?
Just checking.
Okay. I think they already did that in World War II, so I guess.
Cool.
Okay.
Thanks.
But
Go ahead.
I want to mention something about contact theory that's really important. This is key for me. So when we have these racial events, people say, let's have a national conversation on race. And we get black, white, brown people together in rooms like this and we talk about race. Allport says in his book, that's okay, but that has a limited impact. What you do is you get people together of all races to get together to not talk about race for a larger common purpose. And that's when people's racial prejudice will dramatically decline. What does that mean? This is the example I give. Do you remember the movie Remember the Titans, Denzel Washington? So the backdrop is it's based on a true story. You have a high school football team in the 1970s that's trying to integrate. You have all these white and black students who don't want anything to do with one another. They loathe one another. But they joined this team. And what is the goal of the team? To win the championship. And in doing so, because of this larger common purpose, they see each other's common humanity. And then those racial stereotypes and those prejudices just start to melt away. That's key. I think that's one of the things, like, for example, I tell people, you want to really attack racial prejudice in this country, have a national service program. Tell kids that we'll pay for your college if you give us 2 years of national service and you bring together all these different types of Americans, black, white, different classes. That will do a tremendous amount to reduce racial prejudice. That's contact theory.
You mentioned that your mother was not present much during your younger years. I wonder if you could speak to whether that was due to your lack of interest in having her be part of your, or whether it was on her part that she wasn't present very much.
It definitely wasn't my lack of interest because we wanted our mom around. One of the most primal needs I think any human being has is to feel loved by your parents, by your mom. So I wanted her to be around. What I found out later, and you'll see in the book, is that I discovered that the reason that she wasn't around was not voluntary. And it wasn't something that she decided to do. Something happened. And I had to come to terms with what happened. And so it was not her decision to leave us. Hey, Thomas.
Hey, John.
Hi.
I'm so excited that you finally got to this night. I've been looking forward to it for years. Just wanted to say thanks for writing this book and for tackling the topic of reconciliation. I think we need it so much in this country. I have visited Oakhurst Presbyterian before, and I remember there was a song that would always be sung toward the end of the service.
Sweet, sweet spirit.
There's a sweet, sweet spirit in this place, and I just thought that was so beautiful for an integrated church to have a message like that and for people to stand around holding hands. Anyway, I can feel that in this room tonight too, and I just want to thank you for making that possible. I can really feel the Holy Spirit at work. Thank you, John.
Thank you. But to pick up on what Thomas said is that it's something I consciously thought about writing the book. I say, if you believe that we have a future as a multiracial, multi-religious democracy, we have to become better storytellers. And like you take that slogan, "Make America Great Again." I think that's an incredibly effective slogan. There's a story there. America was great, something happened. What is our counter story? What can we say? And as a black man that comes from West Baltimore, the only stories I heard from my environment coming were stories about bleakness, like nothing's going to change. And I tell people, if you write stories that says to white America that racism is inerasable, what are they going to do with that? What incentive do they have to change? So we have to tell stories that are hopeful, that grab people to say, no, there's another way to live. We don't have to live like that. And that was part of what I was trying to do as well. Inez?
Okay, John.
Uh-oh.
Here we go. You're black, so you may not be the one to maybe answer this, but I've asked Nibs several times, and I didn't like his answer. Why would a white person have a problem with not being a racist? Why would they? What do they benefit? We did a workshop one time. Hazel Gerbil, you remember my favorite person, she said that she had no problem saying that she was a racist. She wanted to, if you could quantify it, she said, she wanted to know exactly how much she had to give up because she enjoyed her lifestyle. She enjoyed the power. And I really appreciated it because she told the truth. Mm-hmm. And I didn't see anything wrong with that, but some other people did. But I thought that was an honest answer. And please, so they can be in touch with their humanity, for me, that's not an answer. Because there are people who don't have any humanity, or any feelings of humanity. So why would they? How do they benefit?
That's an excellent question, and so Nibs, how about I say something, you tackle that too.
Okay,
You want to go first?
I think one of the problems for those of us classified as white, and I think one of the things with John's Aunt Mary I recognize so well is how much she kept deflecting John's push on her racism and like saying, oh, it was you were Catholic, that was the problem. It wasn't that you were being black. So I think we're invested in that, but I think white folk tend to see this as a zero-sum game. It's that if people of color become equal, we lose. But my experience is that's not the case. I may lose some political power in the sense that it's not going to be an all-white city council anymore. But I've gained a lot of humanity that I didn't know I was missing by relationships with folk of color, especially black folk that I grew up with. So I think to help people understand that they will gain rather than lose, those of us classified as white, you'll gain a lot. As a preacher, I remember Paul saying, writing early in Romans, that he was not ashamed of the gospel. And I was always ashamed of the gospel because it was so white once I crossed over and began to see it. But I think we have a lot to gain rather than just something to lose. So I think that's something white folk probably need to hear more of, is that you're going to gain a lot of your humanity you didn't even know you were missing. Sort of like a lot of gifts we get. I didn't really know I was missing that until I got this. So that's one of my responses. And we've had that before. So yeah, go ahead. All right, John, you get to do it.
Okay. I can tell you that one of the most unusual aspects to my story that you'll encounter when you read it, and this is something I haven't publicly talked about, but it's a really unusual part of the story, is that when I talk about my mother's father, who to me was the embodiment of stone cold racism, and I think when you give in to racism, it poisons your soul. It does something to you. It did something to him, and it did something to him that was so bad that he had to find this really unusual way to say that he was sorry to me. It haunted him all of his life. We're human beings before we're anything. And I think I have been in a situation when I was growing up where I felt like I hated. And it's a lot to carry around in you, and it does something to you. So I think to answer your question, I think I'm not white, but I'm a human being, and I have hated. And I find it is liberating not to live that way. It's freeing. It's like a weight is lifted off your shoulder. A second part to that answer is this. I think of an anecdote I read about Lyndon Johnson, one of my favorite presidents. And he was talking about integration with Bill Moyers. And he said that the opposite of integration is not desegregation, it's disintegration. It's a nation unraveling. What I mean is, if this country is going to have a future, if we're going to have a future, white people have to find a way to get past this racism, because the alternative is what we're seeing right now. It's exhausting to live in this country now. My wife is an immigrant. She doesn't even at times want to live here. And if we don't deal with this, it's in your interest as a white American to get a handle on this, because this place is going to become an intolerable place to live. We won't attract the best and brightest immigrants. We won't be as productive and as competitive as we can be as a country. What did embracing racism do for the South, for the Confederacy? Places like Mississippi and all these places are still lag behind the rest of the country. Racism is against white self-interest in some ways. And I think that's one of the things I say at the end of the book. When white Americans see that it's in their self-interest to deal with racism, then I think there's change. And I think it is in their self-interest.
I think we've got time for one more question, so we'll take that. And I think John is willing to answer your questions individually. And of course, sign books, so he's selling books. You're doing signing right over there. So, okay, question, then we'll get some introductions.
I know of 3 15-year-olds who are here in the audience, so I'm wondering what advice or what you would tell your 15-year-old self, if you could, and also in 2023, what would you want to tell the high school students that you know, or what have you been telling them?
I would tell them, thank you for that question, to make sure that you're around people who see the world differently, to join communities where not everyone thinks or looks alike. I just think that's so important. We're not just segregated by race, but we're segregated by political beliefs. I'm reading a lot now about people talk about the epidemic of loneliness. We're not even going out, joining community and interacting. I found it incredibly scary to come in community with the white members of my family, to find a relationship with Aunt Mary, to find a relationship with my mother's father. It was scary. They were so different. It was another world, but it helped me so much become a better human being. So I would just tell young people, there are things that you can read in books, but there are things that you can only experience when you're relating to people who are different, and you have to put yourself in those situations, even though it's scary. Can I call out 2 people real fast? Okay. Oh, my brother Patrick is here. He came down from Charlotte.
All right, Patrick.
And I want to call out 2 women. My book is filled with very powerful women that really helped me. But I still have powerful women in my life, and I cannot talk about this without mentioning my wife, Terry Lynn.
All right,
if she can
Terry
stand up.
Lynn.
She has really taught me a lot in so many ways, and she helped me. She's like my shadow editor. And I also want to talk about her mom, Renee. My book, I talk about people who broke barriers, racial and cultural barriers. And her mom has lived that type of life and is living that type of life. And she's an inspiration to me, too. So, Renee, if you can stand up.
All right.
And thank you all for coming.
And John did not want me to reveal this, so I'll give you a little tidbit. How he reconciles with his maternal grandfather is very powerful, and it will blow your mind. So you'll be looking for that in the book. This is a great book. If you haven't gotten one, please get one. It's very powerful, very powerfully written, and it is a page-turner. So I give thanks for that, and thank you, John. Thank you. Let's give John a round of applause.
Thank you all so much for coming out. I have been instructed by the people who are taping this that I need to be in the center to be on the camera for some strange and bizarre reason. So a few quick things before we go to the book signing. It'll be right back there where Deborah and Mickey are signing. There are a few copies left. They went rather quickly. So I'd like to thank Acapella Books, and if you haven't purchased one, and we do happen to sell out, which I predict, Acapella, we will work with John to get signed copies. You can order them from Acapella Books. Always support our local independent bookstores because they do such a great job for us. Also, a pitch for tomorrow night. If you haven't heard or read about it, Terry Jones will be here in conversation with Nana Kwame Adejibuena. It is a hot topic book. It is being called the book of the season. It's been on NPR. It's been in the Washington Post, the New York Times. It's actually a Read with Jenna selection that's coming up. So I'm not going to tell you the title just yet, but the premise of the book is that in the industrialized prison society that we live in, they look backwards to ancient Rome, and they have the prisoners fight as gladiators. And of course, like in ancient Rome, the winner of these fights gains their freedom. The book is called The Chain Gang All-Stars, and that is what they call this group of fighters. It is an amazing book. If you haven't heard about it, I do encourage you to come out. You know Tayari Jones, who was born here, raised here in Atlanta, moved away, and is now back at Emory. She, of course, wrote the book called Leaving Atlanta, which was about the still very touchy subject of the emotional trauma from the Atlanta child murders. Of course, she gave voice to those children whose fathers traveled across the United States, had families across the United States, and their half-siblings were united in Silver Sparrow, and of course, the fantastic An American Marriage. What a page-turner that was. So I do encourage you to come out tomorrow night, and I encourage you to come out to as many of our events as possible. Thank you all so very much for coming, and we will see you all again very, very soon. One more round of applause for John and Nibs.